Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here for this presentation, this discussion about the laws of Chuva and the concepts of Chuva with Rav Moshe Lichtenstein and Rabbi Benjamin Samuels. It is a great honor for us at Rinat to be able to host this discussion of the roots of Chuva, the hidden depths of return and renewal, and the thought of Rabbi Aharon Lichtenstein Zichron Tzadik Livracha. At the conclusion of the program, we're zoche to hear remarks from Dr. Tovah Lichtenstein to conclude the program. This program is being sponsored by the Landis family, by Faye Landis and her family, in commemoration of the third Yahrzeit of David Landis Zichron Livracha. David Landis was a devoted student of Rav Aharon, and we're going to hear a little bit about him from Rav Mosheh in just a couple of moments. In introducing the program, I'd like to recall an essay that Rav Lichtenstein wrote 49 years ago during Shemitah in the year of 1972, at some point during that year. And he describes there two different types of poetry, two different forms of writing a poem. One which he refers to as being lyrical, and the other one which he refers to as being tragic. The lyrical poem is one which has a straight line through, the same theme, there's something consistent. It's a poem all about love, a poem all about mourning, but it's consistent. The other type of a poem is something which he calls tragic, which is a poem which contains within it an internal tension, which is often unresolvable. And in this essay, Rav Lichtenstein speaks about Shemitah, and the character of Shemitah as being something which is, in our day, a tragedy. And that's a shocking thing to say about Shemitah. And in the essay, Rav Lichtenstein speaks about how hard it is to have the ideals of Shemitah, this idea of Shemitah Haaretz and Shemitat Ksafim, this high social vision of what a society should be, and then not to be able to bring that into reality. And during the course of his essay, Rav Lichtenstein describes Hillel's takana of Pruzbul. And he goes into the emotions that Hillel must have felt as he created that Pruzbul. And he describes how our perspective today is often skewed, and how it is that we imagine Hillel implementing this idea. That we imagine this as being something heroic, of Eis la'asos la'Hashem. How wonderful to be able to act on behalf of lenders, to be able to protect the flow of capital to those who need it. And Rav Lichtenstein speaks about the hoped-for reality, that there would not be the possibility of closing doors before lenders, because the creditors would have ensured that such doors would have remained open short of a Pruzbul. And Rav Lichtenstein imagines how Hillel must have felt as he created that takana. And in thinking about our lives, we'll be creating these Pruzbuls in just a couple of moments, or a couple of hours, or days, or weeks. We'll all be making Pruzbuls. And we're going to take it as some other form of remembering Shemitah on some level. But will we feel the tragedy of the Pruzbul? Will we be able to feel the tensions contained within living a halachic life where we fall just a little bit short of the ideals that we have, that Hillel had, that Kadosh Baruch Hu has? And in this regard that I think we can also approach to some degree the topic of Chuva that we are going to be thinking about, the roots of Chuva. The gap that exists between the ideal and the real lives that we all inhabit. And in this regard, Rav Lichtenstein's life is a great beacon, a lodestar for us as community, for us as students. That there was something about Rav Lichtenstein's life which was lyrical, in that there was something that was a process of ongoing growth that is a model to all of us. But at the same time, Rav Lichtenstein understood the world in which he lived, perhaps better than anyone. being able to understand the tragedies, being able to be sensitive to where halacha created tragedies, and that a halachically sensitive person, a Jew, needs to be able to feel the tragedies of life to which tshuva must respond. So as we enter into as we conclude the Shemitah year, as we all engage in these prusbals, and let me think about tshuva. Let us think about the lyrical and the tragic, and may we continue to be guided by Rabbi Lichtenstein's example, both in terms of his writing, but also in terms of his person. I'm going to turn the floor over now to Rabbi Mosheh Lichtenstein, Rosh Yeshiva, Yeshivat HaRAL.
Thank you very much for inviting me for this evening. I find it meaningful on a dual level. The level, of course, of devoting the evening to discussing my father's Torah and his understanding of Chuva. And the second level, an evening in memory of David Landis, who I feel extremely close to. And I have conflicting mandate here. I was told by the Landis family to keep it short and to address only the topic of tshuva. I'm 1,000% sure if my father was here, he would have told me to say a few more words in David's memory. So I will try to strike a shvil hazahav over here, and I will allow myself a few words. I often ask myself, I felt extremely close to David. And, we're not quite the same. I think, we don't agree about everything. We're not necessarily the same square in terms of our ashkafa. And, of course, my father and David were extremely close. And also the same, in a sense, question. I think I know the answer, or I mentioned this, I think, in Bizmano. One of the reasons, of course, is both of them were as straight as a ruler. The integrity, the moral compass of both of them were unswervingly straight. There was no such thing as being even an iota to the left or to the right of what they perceived to be hayashar vehatov. But today, I spent some time reading also this booklet, which is being distributed here, and I know there's another reason also, which is that David was a deep intellectual. Intellectual, first and foremost, he was interested in ideas, even though it had nothing to do with his parnasa, nothing to do with his, he simply was interested in ideas. And I don't know how many people in this room have tried to read my father's book, Henry Moore, The Rational Theology of Cambridge Platonists. It's not easy reading. I can tell the following story. When my grandparents went to the ceremony, which my father got his PhD, so they met Perry Miller, who was my father's second advisor. He was a gadol olam in his area. He told my grandmother, well, I first got the doctorate to read. I took my desk chair, I put my feet on the desk, and I began reading. After 3 minutes, I put the desk straight up, I put my elbows on the table, and I began to read the doctorate. Very few people have been actually able to make it through the entire book, and David not only made it through, he analyzed it, I think, beautifully, and I certainly learned a lot from reading this. Mamash learned a lot, and including a wonderful story he tells there about my father, and I think it's another trait which really brought them together, and therefore it's most appropriate that an evening like this should be in his memory, and I'm sure that the idea of tshuva, which I'll discuss this in a moment, has a lot to do with Acharinu v'nachkora. The idea of self-examination certainly was meaningful for both of them, and may this really be a Ilui Neshama for both of them, each in the Olam Ha'emet, both are Anshei Emet who are in Olam Ha'emet at the moment. So now I move on to the topic at hand. The topic is the roots of Chuva in my father's thought, or actually, to be more accurate, in this book, Return and Renewal, reflects on Chuva and spiritual growth. What are the sources of Chuva? And I'll begin in saying the following. There are certain passages in the book which to deal with this topic directly. There's a whole chapter which is devoted to Tshuva, impetus, and motive. Nevertheless, in order to analyze the perspective on Tshuva within the book, we have to discuss the approach of the entire book to Tshuva. And of course, this entails my father's approach to life in general, and not only to the topic of Tshuva. Something which was a bit surprised when I began reading the book, and maybe I should not have been surprised, was that normally we tend to view Tshuva as a dramatic event. Like it's a drama. A person transforms his life. He makes a U-turn in the middle of life. He's kind of Rabbi ben Dordaya, who understands all of a sudden that his life was misguided, that everything like evaporates on the spot. He has to change his life. He transforms himself, like an Ivan Ilyich kind of figure who, at his deathbed, realizes that everything was wrong, everything went the wrong way. There's none of this drama in this book. The book is extremely undramatic. It deals with tshuva in a very non-dramatic fashion. If I have to phrase it, I would say it's not dramatic tshuva, it's conceptual tshuva. The concept of tshuva is analyzed conceptually. And it approaches sin, and it approaches tshuva, and so on and so forth. And by analyzing the concept, there is extremely little drama. Like there's no attempt to analyze the drama involved in tshuva. For instance, almost no people are meant, no stories, no people. Like it's a book about tshuva which deals with the abstract. It does not, it is very little mention. I'll go back to Rabbi ben Dordaya. The story is Rabbi Mital, Zechet Tzadik Livracha. Every year he would speak about dramatically. It's a medrash with a dramatic story about a person whose life is basically engaged in hedonism, chasing pleasure, and eventually he crosses rivers and oceans and mountains, etc., to seek out the most exquisite prostitute in the world. And when he comes over there, she tells him that his life has been wasted, that it's been meaningless, and he then goes and sits in a valley, in a barren valley between mountains, and he grasps his head, and he requests that the mountains, the hills, the sky, the heavens should all request mercy upon him. Shemayim v'aretz bakshu rachamim alai, harimu gvod bakshu rachamim alai. No one is willing to do it, and then he basically grasps his head and says, "Ein hadavar tuli ela bi," it's only contingent upon me, and he dies. It's a very dramatic story, and Rav Mital milked it for all the drama involved in it. It's mentioned here twice. But none of the drama is dealt with. I'll explain as we go on what my father wants from that story. But this is now my father heard this story every year. He also heard Rav Mital often, and he was quite familiar with the text, with the story. I think he purposely chose not to dramatize it, nor other stories, and he certainly is familiar with many other stories, both in literature and in life, about dramatic tshuva. It's totally missing. Rav Mital would speak often about Miriam Bat Alei B'Tzalim. It's another story. I won't go into all the stories at the moment. They're Dal Midrashim, and basically Rav Mital used the Medrash's literature. And my father, he was aware of all this, and once more he knew he was acquainted with the text. He heard Rav Mital speak about them, and these tshuva drashas which he gave purposely veer in an entirely different direction. Moreover, I'll say, and I'll make another contrast if you want. If you read al Tshuva, the Rav's work, it's conceptual also. To a large degree, it's conceptual, but it's very dramatic. In other words, like I say, the Rav, the power of the book is that, so I would call dramatic conceptualization. He takes an idea, like he makes a chiluk, he makes this conceptual distinction, and then he dramatizes it. To put it differently, he takes one idea and then begins to portray it and to put flesh and blood on top of this. In contrast, I think what we have over here is an attempt to conceptualize tshuva, what I would call comprehensive conceptualization. He takes a concept and he systematically goes one after one. There's so many passages in which he surveys a topic. I'll give one or two examples. For instance, I'm reading from page 90 at the moment. Tshuva entails a plethora of aspects because sin is multifaceted. At least 5 different aspects of sin can be singled out. And then he goes through one by one, number 2. This is a representative passage. It's not the only one. There are many, many others in which there's a list of problems. There are 4 different forms of tshuva. There are 3 different kinds of problems that sin creates, and so on and so forth. In other words, classification and cataloging is a major characteristic of this book. Now, I'd say the following. The categories you choose and how you classify reveals a lot about your approach to life. What maybe is even more revealing is the decision to basically use classification as the linchpin of the entire system. Now, of course, this was not a book. This is simply, it was drasho delivered year in, year out. So it wasn't designed as a book. But on the other hand, year in and year out, he constantly returned to the idea, let's take tshuva and classify it. And this goes on and on. This brings me to basically the main point. The essential approach to tshuva here is the following. Tshuva is the process of self-examination. You can talk about tshuva in many different ways. You can talk about tshuva as being, say, an emotional response. A person feels that he's been corrupted by sin. He says revulsion to sin. Over here, tshuva is first and foremost a process of self-examination. I'll read to you a few passages which bring this out. On page 71, for instance, tshuva is defined as attentive contemplation. The call to attentive contemplation has a normative ring. The critical initial step is taking heed and taking stock. The opening to tshuva, the topic of tonight's discussion, the opening to tshuva is the recognition, common to Socrates and the Musar masters, that the unexamined life is not worth living, or at least that the examined life would be far richer and purer. This goes on and on. There are passage after passage which focus upon self-examination. Take another quick one with the same quote. The examination of deeds, which Rabbi speaks, has various components. Broadly speaking, we certainly subscribe to the Socratic axiom that the unexamined life is not worth living. We need to undergo self-examination at 3 different levels. This is the examination which the Rambam speaks, Minchos Chuva. And throughout the book, tshuva and self-examination are often equated. He begins talking about tshuva, and then it moves on to the idea of self-examination. And 2 major sources are quoted, besides the Socrates. One is the pasuk in Eicha, Nachbesa derachenu v'nachkora v'nashuv ad Hashem. We will examine, we will examine our ways, and Nachbesa derachenu v'nachkora, and then we'll do tshuva. And the other one is the Gemara Masechet Brachot, which talks about if a person feels that he's suffering, that catastrophes are coming upon him, Imrad dam shisurim ba'im alav, yifashpesh b'ma'asav. He should undergo self-examination. These are sources which are quoted not once. They're quoted often throughout, without telling you the page numbers, but they're quoted often because tshuva, throughout the book, the main focus of tshuva is the process of self-examination. There's a fascinating quote that he quotes twice in the Rav. There's a certain Rishonim believe that there's a special mitzvah to do tshuva either on Yom Kippur or Aser Semei Tshuva. And my father quotes in the Rav over here that what's the idea behind, what's the difference between tshuva, the regular tshuva you have to do the whole year round, and the tshuva of Aser Semei Tshuva? He compares to b'dikas chametz. That b'dikas chametz you have to proactively seek out the chametz. You don't only destroy the chametz that you know is in your house, you have to do b'dika, meaning you have to proactively seek it out. So too, tshuva. Through an entire year, you have to repent from sins that you're aware that you sinned. Tshuva, you have to go seek out, or to put it differently, you have to undergo self-examination. Like so, b'dikas chametz, there's b'dikat avonot. You have to examine yourself. This is quoted twice, quite approvingly, because he indeed views the process of tshuva as first and foremost examining what your life and learning the lessons of that. Therefore, one of the major distinctions here, which is clear from many, many psukim, and throughout Tanakh it appears, one of the main motives for tshuva is crisis. But sar lecha umetzucha kol adrim ha'ele v'shavtet Hashem Elokecha. If there's crisis, if there are tzaros, if you suffer, so you do tshuva. Over here it's presented once more, that's a psychological response, rather the Gemara in Brachos is quoted. If a person sees that he's suffering, he should begin to undergo a process of self-examination. Put differently, crisis is a catalyst for tshuva, and this is actually stated explicitly. One moment. Here it is. Page 125. The relation of crisis and I'll read here the caption. Crisis is a catalyst of tshuva. The relation of crisis and tshuva is multifaceted. Once more, one aspect that tshuva is induced by crisis, which may constitute a response, and the response, of course, is to once more go and examine imra adam shisurim be'emav yifashpeish be'ma'asav. Now, this approach to tshuva, which really is the focus upon self-examination, and as quoted before, the unexamined life appears here also 3-4 times. It's quoted. This creates a very particular focus for tshuva. For instance, the focus is upon the process of repair, less upon sin. There's little analysis right throughout the book. There's very little analysis of sin. I mean, sin is mentioned as the problems it causes, but it's left at a very general level. There's no attempt to delve deeply into the psychology of sin, into the ramifications of sin. It's because sin here is not seen as the focus of tshuva. It's a catalyst. The focus of tshuva is really to repair yourselves. It's to mend your ways. But really the truth is not so much to mend your ways in that to what you were doing previously. It's rather to have a spiritual progress, to examine yourself and try to move to the next level. And therefore, the focus is constantly about tshuva, the process of the tshuva itself, less what causes it. Secondly, there's also another, I think, important point here, which is that is a strong emphasis upon partial tshuva. Like 3 or 4 of these drashot deal with mediocre tshuva, tshuva the mediocre, partial tshuva. And now, if you talk about what I call before dramatic tshuva, a person feels his life is wasted, you make a U-turn, you can't stop in the middle, right? A U-turn in the middle is more dangerous than not doing anything. But if you're not talking about a U-turn, you're simply talking about improving your driving. If you're talking about improving your navigation a little better, so then, yes, every incremental increase is an advance. And once you focus upon self-improvement, you can talk also about partial tshuva. And once without getting into all the details, this is a major theme throughout. And I think the recognition is possible because tshuva is defined as a constant progress of self-advancement and self-improvement. The other crucial point, what? Okay, I'll conclude in a moment or so. The other crucial point is that tshuva is initiated by man. There's a famous midrash, my father, I hear him quoted often, who initiates tshuva? One pasuk says, "Shuvu elai v'shuva alechem." Because Baruch Hu calls us, we should return, we should initiate the process. And another pasuk says, "Hashivenu Hashem elecha." No, because Baruch Hu should initiate. Over here, it's clear, man initiates, and this is mentioned explicitly once more. Of course, he's not freeing himself alone. There's divine assistance. According but indeed a messiah, an assistance of significance, but fundamentally the ball is in our court. This matter is dependent, as Rabbi Ben Dordaya said, only on me. This is Rabbi Ben Dordaya. There's Rabbi Mital's Rabbi Ben Dordaya, with all the drama of his wasted life, is transformed here into focus upon the fact that man is responsible for his actions. Okay, now since time is short, I'll just enumerate 2-3 bullet points. Not only is the focus of Chuva upon man, it seems to me throughout that the focus is what we call Chuva mi'yira and not Chuva mi'ava. It's the man-God relationship throughout most of the. There's a lot of talk here about return, both a man and self-improvement and also return to Kadosh Baruch Hu. It's the man-God relationship. But throughout, it's the relationship more of a master and a servant, of a subordination and proper behavior in Beinei Hashem, much less the idea of Shomei Ava. Shomei Ava is quoted here a few times, but it's a relatively minor theme. The idea of man's self-discipline, his improvement, his mitzvot. Tshuva is a mitzvah. The idea of tshuva being mandated appears here often in a central place for the same reason, because tshuva is the obligation of man to examine and to improve himself, and tshuva is not an isolated phenomenon. Once more, I won't quote because of time constraints, but tshuva here is simply one example, a major and prime example, nevertheless one example of a much broader obligation of spiritual life. Tshuva is not like an independent idea or concept or a drama which is played out on its own. Tshuva is simply part of an integrated life of Avodat Hashem. And tshuva is a good example, but it's true of everything else that man does, and tshuva therefore is integrated into Prince Avodat Hashem. Okay, now to conclude this, I'll say the following. Clearly, if tshuva is part of a person's general Avodat Hashem, and tshuva has to do with self-examination and self-improvement, obviously the writers or the speakers' hashkafa will obviously play a central role. And I think no one will be surprised if I say that the drashot here reflect not only my father's approach to tshuva, but to life in general. And the way he defines tshuva, it has to be like that. Now, reading the book at first glance, or the first time I read it, I'll be honest, I was a bit underwhelmed. Because it's, for a simple reason, the drama is missing. It catalogs tshuva upon tshuva, and every time when you catalog into 3, 4, or 5 elements, and you mention 5 different aspects of sin, now by definition, when you mention 5 different aspects of sin, you can't go into each one of them comprehensively. These were drashot. If you gone to each one comprehensively, people would have been stuck for 4 or 5 hours. As it was, none of these drashot were short. And therefore, by definition, it's a catalog, but you get the feeling that more that you can't. Not enough was said. At first, upon first reading, you get the sense that it's you're not being told to do tshuva with an exclamation mark. Like no one's pointing a finger at you. It's rather the general phenomenon is being described. However, upon further reflection, and when I began to review it a second time because of this evening, so I had a very similar experience. What happened often to listen to the drashot. I remember once hearing a hesped that my father gave about someone. It was a 90-minute hesped, and initially I had the same feeling, like there was nothing dramatic. But after 90 minutes, in which he comprehensively and thoroughly and systematically described the whole personality, there's a certain gravitas that sinks in, that you feel that everything's been covered, that when you cover everything, it leaves a tremendous impression. It's like, I would say it's like with a dansha almost. It's a slight pressure applied consistently can move mountains. And this is exactly what the impression I got over here. After you finish reading the book, so there's maybe nothing as dramatic as Roots of Teshuva, or there's nothing as dramatic as this kind of, transformation in life. I remember my father once said he's very much opposed to William James' idea of twice-born souls. It sounds very romantic and very great, but most people are not twice-born souls. It makes a good, in a book it looks good, but in life, most people are once-born souls and not twice-born souls. And I think he also didn't like the drama of all that. And therefore, I think if you read the book, not the second time or the third time, it really forces you to do tshuva. He's gone systematically through everything. What can you say? When everything has been covered systematically, you have no choice but to do tshuva. There's no, it's not like, that's very dramatic, but not for me. It's because it's not dafka the fact that it's more even-keeled and it's less dramatic. It really thrust upon you this obligation. It sinks in. I'm finishing now. It sinks in. And in this regard, I said before, it reflects his hashkafa. As you all know, the book, which was published in his memory, and the title of the book is a quote from Matthew Arnold, who saw life steadily and saw it whole. And this is a perfect description, I think, of this book. The book sees tshuva steadily. It sees tshuva whole. And not dramatically, but steadily and whole. And we see tshuva steadily and whole, it does leave a lasting impression. And B'ezrat Hashem, I think this will have impact upon my coming Elul and Rosh Hashanah, and I hope the same is true of everyone else listening.
Bershus the Marda Astra, my dear friend, colleague, and teacher, Rabbi Chaim Strauchler. I would also like to acknowledge with gratitude the hospitality of my teachers, Rabbi JJ and Untitled Chapter. Thank you for your hospitality. I am profoundly humbled to discuss Moreno Rabbeinu Aharon Lichtenstein Zecher Tzadik Livracha's Torah Chuva. I can say that Rav Aharon is of my greatest teachers. I didn't spend that much time in his share room with him, a year, my second year of Gush, a year in Grus, but his model of excellence in Torah and Avoda just looms so large in my life. I'm sure that's true for so many of us here as well. And I'm deeply honored to share this panel with Kvod HaRosh Yeshiva, Rav Mosheh Lichtenstein, with Dr. Tovah Lichtenstein. Although I've had few opportunities to learn directly from either of you. There's a Torah, just like we say Maisa Rab, there's a Torah HaMishpacha, and being in the yeshiva for 2 years and having that model of the Lichtenstein family on Shabbos, every other Shabbos before us, that was also an education in and of itself, and I thank you with great gratitude for that. This program is dedicated, as we heard before, in beloved memory of David Landy, Zichrono Livracha. I didn't really know David, but my connection with the Yisrael family is profound. I have a deep and abiding relationship with your late parents, Faye, and we've had a chance to know each other, your late sister Miriam, Zichrono Livracha, and I just hope that programs like this give continuing blessing and inspiration to all of their memories. And I'd also like to thank Yoel Weiss for arranging this. And Yoel, you just lost your mother-in-law. So we dedicate our learning also to Miriam Razel Rothschild, Zichrono Livracha. May her neshama have an aliyah. May her memory be for a blessing too. I look around the room, I see so many teachers and rabbis and friends, and I'm just so grateful to be here with you and to talk. I'd like to begin by focusing on what I like to call a favored exercise of Chazal. It's a essentialist proposal and a reductionist exercise. Think of the Gemara in Shabbos Lamed Aleph, right? The gear that comes before Shammai and Hillel. If I could stand on one foot, if you would boil it all down, how do you essentialize what Judaism stands for. And I say this is a favorite exercise because everyone always thinks of that example from the Gemara, but the truth is that it is writ large throughout Sifrei Chazal. Al shlosha devarim ha'olam ha'omed, al shlosha devarim ha'olam kayam. And it's not only in Chazal, it's in the Torah itself, right? From Sefer Devarim, Ma Hashem Doresh Mimcha to Micha, many other places. The Gemara at the end of Makos gathers a lot of these examples of this favorite exercise. This morning at Yeshiva University, unfortunately, I wasn't able to be there in person. I had a levaya that I had to attend to in Boston, but there was a conference celebrating the learning and the teaching and the enduring memory of the late Talmud Rebbe, Professor Rabbi Yitzchak Twersky, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. When I first came to Boston, I had 2 years with the Talmud Rebbe. He was so kind to me. Once a month, I had a meeting with him before his illness really prevented that. And I remember when he passed away, Rab Meir Soloveitchik was saying a story where he once asked his father if you could sum up Talmud Chasidus, right? Is there a pasuk or a mimer that would sum it up? And he said 2 psukim. 1, Kedoshim Tiyu, and 2, Bechol Derachecha De'ehu. You shall be holy, and in all of your ways, not God saying in all of my ways, in all of your ways, you should pursue the religious life. You should get to know God. And so I'm not going to be so presumptuous to try to boil down Torat Rav Lichtenstein into one pasuk or one statement. But I kept this exercise in mind when I read through the 14 Chuva drushes, 12 in this book and 2 in By His Light, and had other readings in mind. Right? Can I touch a light upon a pasuk, upon some type of statement that would serve me kind of as a mnemonic, a way to remember this multifaceted Torah of Rav Lichtenstein on Chuva that Rav Mosheh just so beautifully described its profundity of conceptuality, right? Is there something now, you could stand on one foot, you could try to boil it all down. You can't get very far on one foot. If you want to ambulate, if you want to move from point A to point B, right, then you're going to need 2 paths, and the way is not level or linear, right? So we're going to need a steady path. But it does help to just have this station identification. What is our core value? Is there something that could encapsulate it all? And then like an iceberg with all of the mass of ice under the sea, or you could think of a mountain of granite floating into a sea of basalt, right? What exactly then are the roots, the depth, the profundity of the tshuva? So I did, I believe, come up with a suggested, it's not a pasuk, it's a liturgical phrases or verses, and one of them, as part of this, actually is one of the titles of one of his tshuva drushes. And I actually felt licensed to do this because Rav Lichtenstein himself, in his The Integrity of Tshuva, the drasha, speaks about what he calls Judaism's dual conceptual of divine service. And he indeed begins with this reductionist proposal, this essentializing. Now, Israel, quoting from Devarim Daf Perek Yud, what does the Lord your God demand of you? Only that you revere the Lord your God, that you walk in his ways, that you love him, that you serve the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, to keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes that I are commanding you today for your benefit. So giving voice to Rav Lichtenstein's own words, he says that Judaism moves and asks us to move along a dual axis. On one plane, there are grand, majestic concerns, the very fiber of our religious being, with both serve as a point of departure and the ultimate telos of our religious experience. And that's what I mean by this essentialist exercise, right? Can you boil it all down? And it gives you a direction. I have a starting point. I have an end point. I have a path there I want to get to. On another plane, we speak of a mass of detail, the multiplicity of mitzvot, and then the detail within each mitzvah. And the details, right, are the path relating to the minutiae of daily life and the grand sweeps, walking in God's ways, loving God, serving God. So what is the encapsulating verses that I came up with? Now, just a quick show of hands, how many people here had the zchus to learn in Yeshiva HaRAL? Okay, so you remember what happens on Friday night? We go down to the Mivoah, and we form a circle, and we do what is famously known as the Gush Shuffle, and we sing a song, right? So that song that we would sing is the verses that I would like to suggest essentializes Rav Lichtenstein's Torah Teshuva. Kadshenu b'mitzvotecha b'tein chalkenu b'toratecha. Sanctify us through your commandments and give us our portion in your Torah. Sabenu mituvecha, satiate us with your goodness, v'samchenu, and help us rejoice b'yeshuatecha, in your salvation. V'tahir libenu, this is the verse that's a title of one of his Chuva drashas. V'tahir libenu, and purify our hearts, le'avdecha be'emet, to worship God in truth. Kadshenu b'mitzvotecha b'tein chalkenu b'toratecha. Rav Lichtenstein has so many beautiful chakiras to break down this complex reality of us trying to make our way through life with all of our mistakes and trying to find corrections and remedies and ultimately redemption. He speaks about moral tshuva and religious tshuva. For Rav Lichtenstein, moral tshuva in this sense is not just interpersonal ethics, but moral tshuva relates to discrete acts, to behavior. Religious tshuva is personality, virtue, my character. Rav Lichtenstein speaks about tshuva from. I have to correct and amend the mistakes that I made, the trespasses that I've done. And tshuva to, v'shavta ad, that I want to restore relationship. The tshuva of ferment, of crisis, and the tshuva of repose, of really having that menuchat ha-nefesh, of the mei menuchot that we aspire. Tshuva mi-yir'ah, the fear and the quaking awe. Tshuva mi-ahava, the love sickness that is the pinnacle, the capstone, the climax of Hilchot Tshuva, the tshuva of love, the tshuva of crisis, the tshuva of norm, the tshuva of occasion and the annual, and the tshuva of the perennial and the perpetual. Kadshenu b'mitzvotecha b'tein chalkenu b'toratecha, sanctify us through your mitzvot. Give us our portion in Torah. Rav Lichtenstein speaks about how there's failure at mitzvot, there's neglect of Torah. This has impact. What's the remedy? Well, we regret our actions, we show remorse, we accept upon ourselves never to do it again, we forsake it, and we confess our sins. That could be partial tshuva. We could focus on certain trespasses or failures that we've had, and for Rav Lichtenstein, right, the curative for that, the remedy, is to have discrete correctives to discrete actions, and that's one modality of tshuva. The Rambam elucidates this, says Rav Lichtenstein, in the first half of Hilchot Tshuva, really focusing on these discrete trespasses, what he calls moral tshuva. Sabenu mituvecha b'samchenu b'shuatecha. Let us be sated, inspired, nurtured, and nourished by your goodness. This presupposes a hakaras hatov, and not what Rav Lichtenstein in another essay calls timahon levav, that we're confused, right? We really can appreciate the brachos. We appreciate our own capacity. Rav Lichtenstein has a beautiful tshuva drasha on the dangers of pride. Pride and anger are cousins. They're related. They work together, but pride and how it actually undermines people in their religious actions and their discrete actions. But Rav Lichtenstein takes issue with one voice in our tradition, which says that you have to be a gornish, you have to be a nothing. You can't see yourself as worthy of anything. And in fact, one of the lyrical themes of Slichot and our liturgy on the Yamim Noraim is we're worthless. We're not worthy. But Rav Lichtenstein then says that to do tshuva, you have to be makir tov. You have to recognize that Hashem believes in us. We share in God's power. We are imprinted in the image of God. We have capacity to be better than we have been. There is gedulata adam. There is greatness in a person, and that we can be. And Rav Lichtenstein speaks about how tshuva, yes, is fear and crisis, but it's also confidence and courage and joy. He says, yes, there's joy, and he has a whole halakhic analysis how there's even an aspect of simcha on the yamim noraim as well. The fear grows into awe and then into the love. The shame, the smallness, the nothingness we feel begins to transmute into the recognition of gedulas ha'adam. We are worthless but worthy. Hashem believes in us. And we aim to be like Mosheh Rabbeinu, who is both the greatest and the most humble, recognizing that his courage and confidence is grounded in service to Hashem. And then Rav Lichtenstein speaks about B'tahir libenu la'avdecha be'emet. Emet is truth, honesty, being true with ourselves, being true to the process, but emet is also whole, integrated, not only integrity, but integrated. And Rav Lichtenstein likes to speak about how tahara, v'tahir libenu, tahara is not partial. It's not like the first half of Hilchot Chuva. If you have a chatzitza, if you're holding the sheretz and you're immersing in the mikvah, you don't emerge tahor. B'tahir libenu is what we aspire to. That is where we're trying to end up. That we want to have a total immersion, and that's the tshuva of Ne'ilah on Yom Kippur, when we have to believe the only way we could sin against Yom Kippur is not believe that Hashem will give us kapara. And so we say, B'tahir libenu l'avdecha be'emet. That's focusing on our character, as the Rambam emphasizes in the end of Hilchos Chuva, moving from the yira to the ahava, the total immersion. We are remade. We not only have returned, but we have renewed ourselves. And so that is what we aspire to. We may be beinonim, mediocre. We find ourselves in the mediocre middle, but Torat, HaRav Lichtenstein on Chuva inspires us to pursue a Chuva of excellence, what he calls not mediocre Chuva, but the Chuva of the mediocre. It begins sur meira, separate yourself from the mistakes, the failings, the sins, and then it goes to va'aseh tov, and do good, immerse yourself, come out renewed, come out whole, aspire to shlemut ha'adam, renewal, restoration of self, and most importantly, as an Oved Hashem, in renewed relationship with God. May we merit to walk this path, recognizing on one foot our core principles and the plural complex of the paths that lay before us. But if, as Rav Mosheh Lichtenstein said, if we have opportunity to learn from Rav Lichtenstein, we cannot help but get swept up in the trajectory from the beginnings of tshuva to the ultimate end of restoration of relationship and renewal of self. Thank you.
So we're going to engage now in some discussion about these ideas about the Sefer, and I'd like to begin that discussion with a question to be posed to both our speakers. To summarize, to take what was already a summary of a summary, I think that Rav Moshe was able to really put forward a distinct analysis of how Rav Aharon saw tshuva as being one that, in some respects, does not even require sin. That it's about ongoing growth through a lifetime, in which a person, year after year, is able to come closer to Kadosh Baruch Hu through the process of tshuva. And this life, steady and whole, is something that, in many respects, Rav Aharon, perhaps not telling drama in terms of the writing, perhaps created a drama in terms of his own example, in terms of how it was that he lived his life as an example of this vision of tshuva. And then Rav Benji, Rav Samuels, in describing the content of that tshuva and that life steady and whole, in describing Kadshenu Mitzvosecha, is something that brings out many of the details of what it is that Rav Aharon was able to achieve and what it is that he remains an example for us of Kadshenu Mitzvosecha and V'tahir libenu l'avdecha be'emet. So I'd like to pose a question about how those of us who may not be quite steady and whole? How are we, who often do have real sins, to atone for? How are we to see this example if, in some respects, the Rebbe Lazar ben Dardaya example is somehow not just more dramatic, but in some respects is more true to the world in which we live? That the high aspirations are something which are wonderful to dream of, but all too often in the day-to-day lives, I'm going to speak for myself and no one else in the room, but the day-to-day lives of facing chet is something where those dreams often seem to be a mountain too far.
Okay. Rabbi Lichtenstein is fond of quoting the Gemara in Yuma, Pehei, I think it is, with Reish Lakish. Right, there are two versions. Reish Lakish says, Gadol HaTshuva, she Averos nase lezechuyos, and the second is Zdonos nase ke the first one is shkagos, and the second one is zechuyos. And the Gemara parses it by saying that the first is tshuva miyira and the second is tshuva miyahava. So I think that if people are just stuck on discrete sins and they speak about correcting their behavior, but they're not necessarily focused on the nurturing and cultivation of their larger virtue and character, that is a madrega and tshuva. The Rambam begins Hilchos Tshuva that way, and that is tshuva miyira. And when you do get kapara, then your intentional sins, your zdonot, are like shkagos. It's like you didn't really meet them. You weren't yourself. But you haven't had a rehabilitation of person. And when you really are able to push further along that path, and not only correct our behaviors, but have a reintegration of personality, a reorientation of what our purpose in the world is. What is my relationship with others, with my society? What is the kindness and generosity I need to show myself in recognizing my capacities and talents, and what is the honor and service that is due to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the relationship that I could form. If we could reach that type of tshuva, then we reach tshuva me'ava, right? It's not just the tshuva from, but it's the tshuva to. Then that's the tshuva out of love. That is the love sickness. That is the tshuva of relationship. The Rambam recognizes that's a high madrega. Rabbi Lichtenstein, several points in the Tshuva Drasha, speaks about how the Rambam in the 7th chapter, right, where he deals with character and virtue and larger personality, says something strange. The Rambam in the beginning says that it's a mitzvah to do tshuva. You sin, you have to do tshuva. You have to have remorse, you have to charata, you have to forsake the sin, you have to kabbalah latid, that you're not going to do it again, and you confess it with words. You bring it out into the world of reality. But in chapter 7, he says that a person yishtadel should try to do tshuva. And by that, they'll merit the world to come. So the question is, why yishtadel? It's a mitzvah. It's a normative obligation. So Rav Lichtenstein says, because that is the longer range trajectory. That is the perpetual tshuva that we aspire to over the maturation of our character in our lifetime. We have to try. That's not something that we accomplish in a period of Elul or even in a year, a Yamim Noraim. That is a tshuva of building ourselves over a lifetime. And that's the highest madrega, and that's what we aspire to ultimately. But it is a very good madrega to begin, even if we have the partial tshuva, as Rav Lichtenstein so generously allows us to have partial tshuva.
So I'll just add briefly, I'll begin with a quick story. The Shabbat, after I was appointed Rosh Yeshiva in the Yeshiva, there was a Shabbos, what they call Shabbat Kal Yeshivati. That was the entire Yeshiva had a get-together after the meal Friday night. I spoke then about that the biggest spiritual challenge for people is shchika, loss of spiritual tension, loss of energy. You basically get accustomed to routine. There was a routine of basically, the routine becomes lesser and lesser. My father then said, I disagree. The biggest spiritual enemy is yeush, despair. So I said to him, I agree that despair, he quoted Balatanya also with a quote to that extent. I said, I agree with you that despair is deeper, is a worse enemy. However, most people don't suffer from despair, but everyone suffers from shrika. So it's a question like, how do you define the question? Do you find for the 10% or 20% who have despair, obviously they're much worse off, but I think that 90% of us, or if not 100%, suffer from shrika, meaning loss of tension, burnout, yeah, maybe. It's a bit milder than burnout, I think. At least I hope it's... Yeah, it's like this. I hope I don't suffer from burnout, but I do suffer from shrika. That much I know. Now, so I think, so what's the solution? And here it goes back to a point which Benji mentioned before, and which is emphasized throughout the book. The 2 points here. One is tshuva me'ahava. Tshuva me'ahava means basically a relationship. I'll try to explain how I view at least the difference between tshuva me'yira and tshuva me'ahava. Tshuva me'yira it's not a question of do I fear punishment, it's rather something else. Tshuva me'ahava, I focus upon the particular transgression. I'll give an example. If I forgot to take out the garbage, if I didn't, if I didn't wash the dishes or whatever, I can come and justify it. Well, I forgot, I was tired, I didn't notice, whatever. I give all kinds of excuses, some better, some worse. I can commit, it won't happen again, I promise. And so on. That's tshuva me'yira. Meaning that's a tshuva in which I try to improve a particular point. In other words, I notice a failure, I address the failure and try. Either I address the root of it, I explain why it happened, even though it shouldn't have happened. I commit what we call kabbalah atid, then I request forgiveness. However, tshuva me'ahava is something else. Right? Assuming I forgot to take out the garbage, and my wife gets upset with me. So instead of explaining, we just feel so close to each other. She gives me a big hug, I give her a big hug. So what, if we're such great love, we're going to begin arguing about the garbage? No, it's petty, it's trivial. And that's tshuva me'ahava. Tshuva me'ahava, you still the Kodesh Baruch Hu, and you say, Hashem, kel malei kerachum v'chanun. What does that mean? It means you call the Kodesh Baruch Hu by his first name. It means you can address him on a first name basis. Hashem, Hashem kodem achet, Hashem achrei achet. I feel as close to Kodesh Baruch Hu after the chet as before the chet. And, of course, the great grace is that he also feels the same to us. He taught us that we can do this. Kodesh Baruch Hu told us that even after we sin, we can continue to be close and intimate with him. So if that's the case, tshuva me'ahava means it belittles the chet. The chet is simply overwhelmed by the relationship. So I think part of it, yes, obviously we will sin, and obviously we will make mistakes, but as long as we hold to the relationship, as long as we have this sense of being close to Kodesh Baruch Hu, that I think is a crucial part. I mentioned before that I felt that tshuva me'ahava in this book is, I'm not saying my father's life or in his ashkaf. In this book, I think it's less represented. And matter of fact, just a point I wrote down and didn't mention before, vidui occupies a central place throughout all these essays. Gil midos is really mentioned. But I think obviously he would have told you, and I'm willing to say, I think he would have said also, a good deal is the relationship, and that's what all of us can, that's number one. And number two is, he talks there about tshuva, the mediocre tshuva, the mediocre. He talks about effort. When we were children, my grandfather, Dr. Lichtenstein, at the time, Avis had the slogan, "We try harder," because they were always number two, so the slogan was, "We try harder." And my grandfather used to, as a child, every time we ate the Shabbos table by him, he would mention this, and we believe in Avis, we try harder. And the idea of effort there is deeply embedded. Halacha tells us, right, you can't do tshuva. If you say, I do tshuva, but I'm going to sin tomorrow morning, tshuva is meaningless. It's worthless. On the other hand, all of us know that when we say vidui and when we say ne'ilah, we know we can predict that 2 months from now we will repeat some of the same sins. Now, I know unfortunately we all know this. No matter how much we say lashon hara, that the odds of our saying lashon hara come Kislev or Tevet are quite high. So why is this not being hypocritical, and why is this not ichtave ashuv? The answer is, I have the best intentions in the world, but people have shchika. People can't live at the same level of intensity the entire year. Put differently, I have no aim whatsoever of sinning again. I can predict, I can forecast it's going to happen. But a forecast is simply, it's knowledge of the future. It's not trying to cause it. It's not trying to will it. I don't want to do it. Unfortunately, I can forecast I'll also annoy my wife sometime during the coming year, even though I have no intention of doing it, chas v'shalom. But nevertheless, what are the odds? The odds are that's going to happen. So as long as we focus upon our effort, and as long as we're sincere, so that's legitimate. Even though we say, yes, human nature, everyone will sin, everyone is frail, so we accept human frail, like to err is human. And by the way, I should just conclude with this. We say this, and David HaMelech says, we say this in Kihu Yada Yitzreinu. He's aware of our desires, our impulses. Zachur Kefar Nachnu. He knows that we're only material creatures at the end. And David HaMelech says even more so. David HaMelech in Mizmor Aleph, when he talks about Bathsheba, David HaMelech says over there, Hein ba'avon cholalti, I was created in sin. Uvechet yechmatni imi. Man is conceived in sin. Now the conclusion of this is not different. Man is a corrupt being like some of the Protestant versions. It's rather because man is created. Simply, if that's how man comes to the world, so Kadosh Baruch Hu has to accept the fact that we are not perfect, that we're fallible, because we're programmed to be like that. So therefore, it's not being hypocritical, but as long as we make the effort and we are sincere.
The vision of the human person that's being described both by our speakers but also in Rabbi Aharon's writing itself, I think it's also something for us to reflect upon. And that is to ask about the nature of the tshuva endeavor and the place of sin in order to spark tshuva. And if we're describing tshuva as something which in some respects does not require sin, but rather it's an ongoing process throughout a lifetime of improvement, of seeking to slowly but surely come closer to Kadosh Baruch Hu, what does that say about the human person, about who we are and what our task is here within our worlds? Can you explain that more?
Okay, so a major idea throughout the book, and Rabbi Tarragon in the afterword also emphasizes this, is that tshuva is predicated upon free will, b'chira chovshit. Now, the idea of tshuva, that man can improve himself, means that Kadosh Baruch Hu has trust in man. If he didn't trust man, in other words, tshuva is a mitzvah. And my father discusses this a few times in a few places in the book over there. And he quotes opinions that tshuva is not a mitzvah. He considers them inconceivable. He quotes Michas Chinuch, and he quotes it once in the name of the Rav, a few times in his own position, that tshuva is obviously a mitzvah. It's not only a mitzvah, there's many other things as well. It's an opportunity, but it's also an obligation. And the Kadosh Baruch Hu mandates tshuva because he believes in us. You can only mandate tshuva if you believe that man has a potential to improve. And the answer is, I think, yes. In other words, the idea of tshuva is, and that's why he emphasizes so much b'chira chovshit, that man can choose, he can choose to improve himself, and man can take upon himself the task. And some of the unexamined life is not worth living, but life which cannot be improved may not be worth living. And the implicit assumption of tshuva is that man can improve life, that man can have self-discipline. And now he also discusses there the idea that the Gemara has a machloket, there's a disagreement in the Gemara, whether a person has to every year repeat the sins only when you have to confess only the sins of the past year. You have to go backwards in time and confess sins from 10, 20 years ago. Matter of fact, my brother Rav Meir once told us that my father told him that the older he got, the longer Shemon Esrei became. Because every year he was saying vidui for the sins from 1950, 1951, 52, and the longer his life got, the more he had to account for. And in the book he states that he even though the Gemara has a disagreement, he thinks it's inconceivable that a person should not have to say vidui every year for all the previous sins, because I think he's looking at the vidui is a process of self-improvement. It's a process of self-improvement. You have to draw lessons. If vidui is simply to erase, so to speak, the stain. So once you've erased the stain, a cleaned garment doesn't have to be cleaned again and again and again. But if the idea of tshuva is self-improvement, it's to draw lessons, and the Rambam certainly says this in a few places. But the idea of tshuva is let's draw lessons from the past and make our lives better lives. So obviously we should draw lessons not only from last year but from 10 years ago as well. And if the idea of tshuva is that man, yes, you should believe in man. And if I take the same mizmor that David talks about Sheva, he doesn't only say Hein bavon cholalti. He also says, Alamda poshim drachecha v'chatei melecha yeshuv. I'll serve as a beacon for tshuva. I'll show people that improvement is possible, that it's possible to repent, and I will take it to greater and newer heights. And that's, of course, the idea of zdonot kizchiyot, which was mentioned before.
I would just add that the Rambam and Rav Lichtenstein emphasizes this, indeed puts Bechira Chavsh's free will as the linchpin of tshuva and places it smack dab in the middle of Hilchos Tshuva. And the Rambam goes so far, it sounds hyperbolic. He says that anyone has the ability to be as righteous and as great as Mosheh, or to be as wicked as Yeravam ben Nevat. And Rav Lichtenstein in his own writings says we don't believe whether it's nature, nurture. There was a question in science and religion about neuroscience and our limitations of free will. There was an Orthodox forum on it not many years ago, and can we really be as great as Mosheh? Can we really have the capacity for inhumanity of a Yerabam or some evildoer like that? Do we really have unlimited ability and capacity? So here I would differentiate between what I would call an explanation and an attitude or orientation. Right? If we're looking for an explanation, Rabbi Lichtenstein himself in one of his essays recognizes, and he says even Chazal recognize, that there may be constraints upon a person. They may not have just complete plasticity. But at the same time, right, if we take the attitude or orientation that we are capable of much more than we've proven already in our own lives, that if we make mistakes, we are b'nei malachim, or the children of God. We are able to correct and improve and elevate ourselves, that we could aspire to excellence. Then we will achieve, and we will avoid what Rav Moshe, you just said, is the killer of tshuva, despair. And so I really think, we take the attitude and orientation that we have that free will, that we have that capacity, and whatever the constraints are, that's for the cheshbonos of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But for our own aspirations, we have to be free agents with great promise.
There's been much comments in the general society about the mental health crisis in which our society is immersed. And I think it's something for us to consider the role of tshuva within that discussion for good, and perhaps also for some extra challenge in terms of how it is that a Jew who is facing mental health crisis comes into this period of the calendar. And the aspiration that we've been speaking about, this idea that a person is meant to utilize tshuva during the course of a lifetime to grow, can also be a great tool to facilitate, I might say, a healthy attitude towards tshuva that in some respects is very different from some of the guilt of other approaches to tshuva. That it's not about a person collapsing with chet, but rather there's something about an aspiring towards something greater and higher. And so I'd like to ask that our speakers reflect upon what is this approach to tshuva, what does it say to the moment of the despair that is really taking place around us to a certain extent? And is there something that we can get in terms of a nechama that comes through this book?
I would just briefly say that we're all familiar with Rav Lichtenstein's high standards and aspirations and expectations of excellence. I think that's fair. That's a standard he held himself to, and I think that was his hope for his Talmidim and all who chose to learn from him. And yet, if you read these Chuva drashas, there is an amazing degree of understanding, of generosity, and of realizing that people need to measure their aspirations and gradations. And so, mental illness is a very serious malady. It's subject not to a wholesale prescription, but an individualized format. We don't want a tshuva process or even a shmiras hamitzvos process to be injurious to a person, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a place. It just means that they have to be customized for the person and their particular needs. But in Rav Lichtenstein's view of tshuva, there is the tshuva of the excellent and the excellent tshuva. But there's this beautiful tshuva drasha that he has on the mediocre tshuva and tshuva of the mediocre. The tshuva of the mediocre, or the tshuva of the challenged, whatever their challenge is, doesn't have to be mediocre tshuva. It could be just the right tshuva for them. Figuring out what the right tshuva is, that's some of the complexity, right? That's the roots beneath the surface. But there's a great deal of personalization and generosity that comes across in Rav Lichtenstein's adumbration of the process of tshuva.
I'll just state the book is a normative book. It doesn't deal with, the book is written as a normative book. It deals with normative issues. How do we apply to each individual in his station and his circumstances? This book is not doing that, and my father was not a mental health professional, and therefore that was not his goal in these drashot. The goal is to set a normative standard. Application is obviously individual to each person. I'll just say that clearly the approach in this book, not surprisingly, is not that of the Musar movement. The Musar movement tried to basically posit tshuva, and not only tshuva, but religious life in general, upon guilt and fear of death. Oy lanu yom hadin, oy lanu yom hatochecha. Rishon Salanter tried consciously to instill a deep sense of guilt. Rishon Salanter thought that man was a deeply flawed being. I'll say like this. The Musar movement, certainly Rabbi Salanter, and then the classic movement, Kelem and the like, they basically saw a man begins life at minus 100, and the goal of tshuva is to raise him to 0. Unlike, and they really saw man as a disease. No, every man is like that. Unlike the non-Musar movement, they thought man begins at 0, and the idea is to elevate him to 100. And when the Rav writes in Ish Halacha that Rabbi Tzil Blazer came to Volozhin and he tried to convince to study Musar, and Reb Chaim said to him, Musar is like antibiotics. If you're sick, if you have an infection, you take antibiotics. So if the Musar movement feels that they have religious infections, fine, we don't. And my father would always comment that maybe Volozhin was a bit too self-satisfied, but on the other hand, I think it's clear that this is not just like a cavalier exchange. That Reb Chaim really hit the nail on the head in terms of how you view human nature and the human situation. Rabbi Salanter really believed that man is a deeply flawed being, and the only way to shake him to his senses is A, to talk about fear of death, and B is this deep sense of guilt. And the Rav clearly was, I can tell you that he writes in Ish Halacha, but when I was a young 17-year-old, I was in Boston by the Rav, and after Yom Kippur, between Kippur and Sukkot, so I was by the Twerskis, by my aunt and uncle, and one day I was alone with the Rav in the kitchen, and I asked him, as a curious 17-year-old, I asked him, what do you think about the Musar movement? He was on his way back to his room. Remember, he stood in the doorway of the kitchen, turned around and shot. Mama shot he said, I don't like the Musar movement because Yadus is based upon yira and not pachad. It's based upon awe and not fear. And then they turned around and walked out. Made this, and like this exclamation mark. And this is true also here. The entire book is based upon the idea that man has free will, he can improve himself, man has the potential for greatness, and not the idea, and then guilt is not, now, obviously you should be guilty if you made a big sin, but by the way, I think you can all assume my father did not tell people to do kaparot like they did in the 17th century, like not to eat for a week if you sinned or whatever, but there was once a story that someone, by mistake, he ate chametz and Pesach. He thought he was buying a Pesach cake, and his wife told him it was too tasty, and it was. He came to my father really upset. My father told him that he should, he gave him a tshuva, he gave him a kapara. I don't know what it was exactly, but like he told him for a week or whatever, not to partake of certain pleasures. So obviously, but at its root, he did not believe in this guilt, instilling guilt as part of the tshuva process. So.
I'd like to call upon now for Dr. Tovah Lichtenstein for closing remarks. Please rise, yes.
I certainly don't want to talk about Chuva in the presence of these participants who certainly know much more about it. But I would like to say Epiphany was not part of my husband's life. He was not waiting for great discoveries or great Gilui Shechina. He really spent his life, and he really thought life should be examined very closely. Life needed to be examined. And if one were to know really how he considered Tshuva, I think one has to think about what Yom Kippur, which is the day that is mechaper, the end process of all the Sept Yemei Tshuva. And these drushes were given at the Grus Center during a Sept Yemei Tshuva. And what the end of it all is Yom Kippur. And Yom Kippur, those who've been in the yeshiva understand that Yom Kippur was really a special day. And that day was spent, as I think, as my husband thought, that a Jew should spend the day that he stands really to levakesh al chayav. On one Rosh Hashanah, just as an aside, and I'm interrupting myself, but I reminded myself, on one Rosh Hashanah, this was probably 48 or 49 years old. My Shai, who's 50, was a little baby. And I was davening because I couldn't go up to the ladies section because he was going to make a lot of noise. And so I was davening in the steps that lead up to the base medrash. And we used to have a butka on the roof on which there was a shomer. And the kids used to go up to the butka with a shomer. And there was a button there. And that button was to be pressed in case there was an attack of mechablim. And so one of the kids pressed the button on Yom Kippur. And everybody ran, and this one ran for the guns, and this one ran under the table, and I ran to get Shai, and my shaitel flew off, and it was a bad thing. And when it was all over, my husband said to them, that's when you think a mechaber is coming. We're all standing in front of Melech Malchei HaMlachim. Do you know how you should feel? And so he had a great Yirat Hashem. But as my son said, he also had a great Ahavat Hashem. But he also had a great Ahavat HaTorah. And I'm now going back to Yom Kippur after I interrupted myself. Yom Kippur in the yeshiva insisted of at night, of taking the Sefer Torah out. And anybody who was in the yeshiva remembers how my husband took the Sefer Torah out and said, Or Zarua L'Tzadik or the Yisrael Leiv Simcha. That is not the Jew. That's the Jew that's standing in front of God. It was almost like a coronation. And then there was the davening. And when he said Al Chet, I used to stand there and think to myself, how long can a man stand bent over, and say Al Chet. And I think he never in his life during the day heard Nisana Tokev. I don't think he ever heard it on Yom Kippur. Comes Nisana Tokev, we all get up and we cry because we're right to cry, because we really are standing at a very difficult moment. And he would stand there. I don't think he ever heard it. And I don't think he ever heard it on Rosh Hashanah either. When it was Malchus, Zichronos, and Shofos, they were equal. When there was... And he had to finish his Shmoneh Esrei on Rosh Hashanah because he was Matkiah. But on Yom Kippur, he didn't have to. And he would stand there, and they would start Chazaras Hashatz, and he would continue. So there was that. But then there was the learning at night, but that was at night. Okay, I went to at night Yom Kippur. He davened. He said the longest Shmoneh Esrei you can imagine, and then he gave a shiur. A shiur in Gemara on an inyan of Avodat Yom HaKippurim. Avodat Yom HaKippurim in the Beit HaMikdash. And he would say it until the last boy fell asleep in the back row. Till what time, Moshe? Did he say what?
Past midnight.
Past midnight. Past midnight. Then he would come home and get up and go back and daven. And... the end of Yom Kippur, all of a sudden, he was a different person. As if there was a faith that God would forgive. And anybody that didn't hear, Rav Amital and he, dance afterwards with all the yeshiva and say, Min HaMeitzah Karatiyah, and that was the experience of Yom Kippur. It's Min HaMeitzah, from the depths of my despair, of my being human, of my sinning, of my not being able to do what I should. I have examined my life. I have done what I have to do. And now, Rabbeinu Shalom, you're going to accept it. And I think that is really what Shuva was for him. And I want to talk a little bit about David Landis, who indeed was there's an expression in Hebrew, a Talmid Vatik, which is not a question of his age. It's a question of his relationship. And doesn't make a difference. You were a year in the yeshiva 30 years ago, but you're still a Talmid. And he had a real special relationship to my husband. And he would come visit us, and that was very important. But when David was sick, I have come to the conclusion one has to have a special skill to know how to die. It's not simple to die. And I think Parshas Dvarim, the whole Sefer Dvarim, is about how Mosheh died. Mosheh didn't want to die. He really didn't want to leave Am Yisrael. And that was his final speech to Am Yisrael. People don't want to die. And David realized that if he was going to die, he was going to die like a man, like a Jew, like a believer. And I truly think that this is a wonderful thing to have this evening in his memory. And I thank you all for coming. And I wish you a ksiva v'chsima tova l'shnat Chaim v'shalom.